On May 28th of 1830, President Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act. What you have to know is that the land that is now the United States was previously lived in before anybody from England got here. There were all these indigenous people living and already living in groups with cultures and rules and laws and the whole thing, right? And when the English got here, they made some agreements with those people about, all right, we're going to come and do this, but these areas you can keep control over. And then the United States had the Revolutionary War, broke off from England, and theoretically inherited all of those agreements. But there was this conflict, which is that the federal government is in charge of what happens kind of at the federal level. The state governments are responsible for what happens at the state level. And the states, some of them, decided that they didn't like the agreements that had been set up, and they would like to forcibly take back that land from the indigenous people. So there's what they called in all of these paperwork, they called the 5 civilized tribes, which is definitely, we don't refer to people as civilized and not civilized. But that was the language used, and that refers to the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek Muskogee, and the Seminole. And those 5 groups were living spread out across what is the United States. And they had land. And Georgia wanted to kick the Cherokee off their land and out. And the federal government kept asking for more time to figure out a solution. President Andrew Jackson's solution was that he was going to move all of these people forcibly, if necessary, by walking them a long, terrible trip that ended up being called the Trail of Tears, walking them from their homelands to west of the Mississippi River. The problem, there's lots of problems, but the problem is that west of the Mississippi River, what is now Oklahoma and Kansas, what was territories that the federal government had access to, these are wildly different land than the Appalachian Mountains or Florida. So all the ways of life of these people, you have different animals, you have different food, you have different plants. Like the entire way of being doesn't work in Oklahoma. So even all the problems that are there, one of the big problems is that we still see this sometimes in the stories, right? We read stories at the house, and the animals in the stories are the animals of Florida or the Appalachian Mountains, even though the stories theoretically are coming out of Oklahoma now. This is the Indian Removal Act. Becomes what's called the Trail of Tears. One of the routes comes through Springfield, Missouri. The northern route comes through our town, and you can see the little markers on it. And they try to fight this in the Supreme Court a couple of different times. The last time, there's a Bible translator named Worcester. Samuel Worcester is a white missionary Bible translator living with the Cherokee in Georgia. And he says, first off, they arrest him. They arrest him and about 14 other people, and then they try to pardon all of them, and he refuses the pardon so that the Supreme Court can hear his case. And his case is basically that Georgia is arguing that to live with the Cherokee, he has to have permission from the state. And he's arguing that if the Cherokee say that he can live with them, then that's all it takes because they are responsible for their own land. And it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in favor of Worcester. They say he didn't violate any laws by living with the Cherokee without talking to Georgia first. And President Samuel Jackson ignores this. He just does not. Worcester stays in jail. They ignore it. They continue with the Trail of Tears exactly as they had previously been planning on doing it. And it's this moment in history that the U.S. president and the Supreme Court go essentially toe-to-toe disagreeing, and the president ignores the Supreme Court. So today is important. 195 years ago today is important because it sets up the cultural annihilation and physical hardship for the 60,000 people who were moved as part of this. And it sets up the Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court is in conflict with the US president. There's another reason that Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act and the Supreme Court case and Worciter's case and the Supreme Court being ignored by President Andrew Jackson matters. So last year when Vance got added to the ticket, I was talking about this with one of my friends, and we were talking about how the Vance addition was a brilliant counterbalance, or attempted to be a brilliant counterbalance, right? All of the weaknesses that Trump brought politically of, Vance covers a bunch of this. Vance is poor roots. I had already read Hillbilly Elegy. I'd also read a bunch of critiques of Hillbilly Elegy. I knew who Vance was when Vance was chosen, right? And we were talking about how he's poor background, or at least can present himself that way. He's a Marine and can present himself that way. He has a family that he's clearly actually, he's there, right? He has a religious tradition that he himself has sought out and figured out. He's a great counterbalance on that ticket. And I'm not saying he's a great vice president. I'm saying he's a great counterbalance from a logical perspective when you're looking for somebody to put there. And when I was talking about it, I said, here's the problem I have with Vance that actually the piece that gut check terrifies me. And that is the way he's talked about President Andrew Jackson. President Andrew Jackson stood up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, we disagree with this, and Andrew Jackson is the president who just ignored it, just acted like the Supreme Court didn't exist. He did not in any way acknowledge what had happened. Basically, he just kept doing what he was going to do and figured the Supreme Court would work itself out. And there's that famous quote where he says, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. And Vance repeatedly has used that quote and used Andrew Jackson as the model of the executive and the judicial in conflict. So the Indian Removal Act that happened 195 years ago today sets the groundwork in motion for the kind of constitutional conflict we have right now, where we have a judicial branch and we have an executive branch, and they're staring each other down. And before he was elected, Vance had said, you have to stand your ground. If you are the president and the Supreme Court is in conflict with you, you have to stand your ground exactly as Andrew Jackson did, which told us what was going to happen.